Welcome to XX Will Travel, a podcast for independent women travelers. I'm Kathy Polkerbeck.
And I'm Inez Belina.
And today we're here with author and Chicago local and my neighbor, Gina Frangello. Gina Frangello's fourth book of fiction, Every Kind of Wanting, was released in September 2016 and was included on several best of lists for 2016, including in Chicago Magazine and the Chicago Review of Books. Her last novel, A Life in Men, was selected for the Target Emerging Author Series and was a book club selection for Nylon Magazine, The Rumpus, and The Nervous Breakdown. She's also the author of two other books of fiction, Slut Lullabies, which was a Forward Magazine Best Book of the Year finalist, and My Sister's Continent. Her short fiction, essays, book reviews, and journalism have been published in such venues as Salon, Dame, Plowshares, the Boston Globe, BuzzFeed, the Chicago Tribune, the Huffington Post, Fence, 5 Chapters, Prairie Schooner, the Chicago Reader, and in many other magazines and anthologies.
Thanks so much for coming. We're both really big fans of your work, and I've been looking forward to this interview for a while. I'm sure Kathy has as well.
Oh, thank you guys.
Yeah.
We know you've written like a ton of stuff, but I think what we both gravitated towards was your novel A Life in Men and also your most recent book Every Kind of Wanting, because they both skip around locations a lot. Travel figures heavily in both of them. Some of the places that, they depict are Greece, Kenya, Mexico, England. Have you traveled to these places?
Yes, I've been everywhere that I've written about except for Gander in Newfoundland, which is the epilogue of A Life in Men. A Life in Men has about 13 different locations, and that's the only one I haven't gone to.
Wow.
Yeah, and how did you do your research for those books? I mean, keeping in mind those locations.
So it wasn't very difficult at all with Every Kind of Wanting, other than, actually, I should really back up. I have a huge error in what I just said, which is fine. But I also have not been to Caracas in Venezuela. That all came from my best guy friend that I've had since I was 10 years old, who did grow up in Venezuela like Miguel in the novel in Every Kind of Wanting. And so all of my Caracas information came through him. So that was my research essentially for that location. But everywhere in A Life in Men, sometimes the countries that I was depicting, the plot was happening at a very different year than when I had been there. So I would have to do a lot of research in, kind of back time. Like in Kenya, Mary is in Kenya in the early 90s, and I was in Kenya in 2010. So that's it's a really different place. So I did a pretty extensive research, having to read a lot of things about, the political climate of Kenya at that time and what was going on, even in terms of whether particular safari lodges that Joshua, her boyfriend, would be working at even existed at that time, and, what the conventions were then compared to when I was traveling. So I guess the research varied depending on where the place was. I mean, in some cases, like in Mykonos, Mary was there, Mary and Nix were there at exactly the same time I was there, so no research was necessary. A lot of the details were just places I had been. And likewise with Arthog House in the House of Reinvention, the second chapter of A Life in Men, Arthog House is a place I lived in London, and the Latchmere Pub is a place I worked in London. So again, it was exactly at the same time in 1990. So.
Did you do anything like look back over your old journals or old pictures to spark that?
Yes, definitely. I have a terrible visual memory, which is not a great trait in a writer. So I had to look at a lot of photos to actually remember the physical details of things that I wanted to describe. I mean, I'm this type of person who wouldn't remember what color the building I lived in was, or what side of the house the plaque that says Arthog House was on. And I wanted to be really specific about certain things. So I did do that. I also had a lot of journals and a lot of letters that were from those times. And in some cases I reread them, but in other cases I didn't do it as extensively, because I think one of the things that can happen when you're writing about a place that you've been, particularly when it's not a place that you live, and so you've been attentive to it the way a traveler is attentive to detail, is that when you're writing a fictional book, you don't necessarily have to put all your own personal observations and experiences in there. And so sometimes when I would reread things, I'd get really hung up on things that were important to me that weren't necessarily important to the characters.
Yeah, for sure.
So, for those of you who don't know, it's hard because I don't want to give away any part of the book. I want you to read it because Inez and I both think it's super amazing. But one important thing to know is there's a study abroad element in Life in Men. And it's basically a worst case scenario for what can go wrong when you study abroad. For example, assault, illness, a hijacked plane, unintended pregnancy. It's like every mother's nightmare.
Well, not all of those things are specifically associated with the study abroad element.
You're right.
The women in the book who are about 19 or 20 at the time in 1988 go to Greece alone, the two of them, and they have some misadventures there, yes, that lead to some bad consequences. But the study abroad aspect, where Nix is studying in London at Regent's College, where I studied abroad, I think the biggest casualty of what happens to her there is that there really isn't anybody to be intervening in what's happening in her life. So it's pretty easy to kind of slip through the cracks of your own crisis when you're abroad and unmoored and away from people who know what you're usually like. So that, I guess that could be an aspect of a cautionary tale, but it's also one of the great things about travel is that you can reinvent and you can do things that you wouldn't do at home.
And even when bad things happen, speaking from personal experience as someone who was held up at knife point in broad daylight with 4 of her friends when I left the country for the first time to study abroad, like, I wouldn't say it's a cool story, but but it's like a survival story where you can be like, this happened to me.
Oh, absolutely.
And I still love to travel. So I guess my point in asking this question is, what would you say to someone who reads your book and has second thoughts, or a mom who reads your book and is like, I'm not letting my daughter study abroad?
Wow. I mean, I arrived in London when I was studying abroad in the month after the Lockerbie disaster. Yeah. So the Lockerbie disaster does figure in the book, and because I arrived in London basically to the pallor and shadow that had just cast over the study abroad community. A lot of Syracuse students died. I mean, a lot of American students died in general, and people who I met there who were also studying abroad, most of them knew someone who had just died. And where I was, at Madison, Wisconsin, going to school normally, Lockerbie wasn't a massive part of the consciousness, but in London it really was. So there was that. But other than that aspect, which obviously, terrorism is, of course, much more present in the American consciousness than it was at that time. It really wasn't at all in the American consciousness at that time, though it was pretty commonplace in England. But other than that, in a way, I feel as though everything in the book ultimately points to travel being a positive rather than negative experience. Mary, of course, has cystic fibrosis, and so she does encounter illness when she's traveling, but kind of the whole point for her is trying to live her life on a pretty large canvas and push the limits of experience in a very limited time. And so she certainly knows about those risks going in, and of course by the very end is actively courting them in a certain way because of the way she prefers to go out.
Yeah, I actually studied abroad through Syracuse, and it was in the late 90s, and that was still, Lockerbie still weighed very heavily over the experience just because it's a mark in their history. Right. So we were, and like you said, I was coming from Chicago, so I was not aware of that until I got there, but it still cast a shadow over the program. And so you mentioned Mary having cystic fibrosis, and she's actually based on a real person?
Well, the fact that she had cystic fibrosis and is an avid traveler is definitely based on a real person. The places that she goes, her life experiences, her personality, all of those things are completely not based on my study abroad friend Sarah, who I lived with in London. The places that I depict are not the places she went, but Sarah did have cystic fibrosis. She was studying abroad in London. She had just come from having done an archaeological experience elsewhere, and she ultimately did die overseas in, I think, 1998. She was living in Jordan among the Bedouins at the time that she died. She contracted meningitis and died very quickly because the immune system of people with cystic fibrosis is really compromised. So I found her very inspirational. I mean, she did, at the heart of it, do pretty much what Mary had done in terms of not letting doctors and parental caution dictate the way that she led her life. But I also try to be clear that the book isn't based on her life in any way. Mm-hmm. The experiences are completely different.
But did you always want to write about her in some way?
I did for a while. When she first had died, I thought it would be amazing to actually try to write some kind of biography of her, because I thought she was a really amazing person. But we had not kept in very close contact, so it would have required so much involvement from other people from her family who I didn't really know. That was a very short-lived idea that I had, that somehow I could actually write her life story. And then I didn't really start writing A Life in Men for about 10 years after her death. So it had always lingered in my mind somewhat that travel is a huge deal for me, and the experiences of illness, well, were not as big of a deal for me then as they are now, but were really interesting to me. I had had enough health problems that I had a sense of how limiting they could be in a person's life, and a lot of admiration for people who didn't allow that to happen. To the extent that they're able. So yeah, I guess you could say she certainly hung around as an inspiration.
So in an interview, you mentioned that while Life in Men focuses more on travel as self-exploration, Every Kind of Wanting is more about displacement,
right?
Which I found really interesting, because travel for me has been probably the experience that's most shaped me as a person. Like, listeners know this, but I am the daughter of a diplomat, so every 3 years we would move, and I had this experience of displacement, although maybe not forced displacement in the way that, like, refugees are, displaced, or immigrants, but still it was, this constant, like, leaving and going away. But on the other hand, it also inspired my love of travel as self-exploration. So I've seen both, like, the positive and negatives for it. And I was just wondering how you approached these kind of two sides of travels in the work.
Yes, I mean, Mary, of course, and I think there is a certain amount of critique of this in the novel, including from Mary herself, but Mary is someone who travels as a form of self-enrichment, which is very different, and there's an argument for saying even an entitled type of position, that you're stopping by as a tourist in other people's lives and worlds in order to better yourself, although it's certainly something that I have done, isn't always clean. The characters in Every Kind of Wanting are very different from that. It's not really so much a novel about travel as it is a novel about exile and identity shifts depending on where you live. So the places in that novel are Caracas, Chicago, Miami, and Beaver Island, Michigan. And in none of the places are the characters really travelers. They're not there to take in sights or learn about a culture and try to expand their consciousness. They have lived in the various places or have family members in the various places, and each one has required a kind of new identity, assimilation, and difficulty, depending on where they are and where they come from. So the two characters who are really prominent in that novel, Miguel and his younger sister Lena, have a very, very different identification with Venezuela, because Lena was only born there and is taken to Chicago as a baby. She doesn't have a strong sense of herself as an immigrant or even really as a Latina woman. She's bisexual. She is very urban. She has a very wide life in Chicago that includes all different kinds of people. she's had a couple of husbands and, who are of different ethnicities. So she's very different from Miguel, who came to Chicago at the age of 10 and had a very, very strong sense of himself as an immigrant, as someone who spoke Spanish and had to learn to adapt to his new environment here, and for a while changes his name to Mike, and then eventually goes back to Miguel and sort of embraces his identity in ways that he tried to run away from originally. So they're very different from Mary and Nix, who are, essentially, who are travelers, who are American women who are traveling elsewhere.
So what are some techniques you use or keep in mind when you're writing about a location?
So when I first was writing, I've written my whole life, but when I first started writing short stories in college, one of the things that I fell into was the sense of not describing place at all. I really would just sort of write about a place as though everybody could see it exactly as I did. And obviously that's excessive because people don't know the place the way you do. And when you're just kind of assuming that the reader can read your mind and shares all your experiences, it's limited. However, I do think it also can create a sense of intimacy and authenticity when you are not constantly over describing everything as though you're writing, a travel book. It's not Lonely Planet,
Right.
People are not reading a novel in order to find out what's on the corner of X and Y and where you can get the best Thai food. And, so I try, as I continue to remember to include the important details that shape the characters' experiences, I also try to remember that it's not what somebody's reading to plan for their vacation. And so you can really go overboard. And I try not to do that. I usually trim down more details rather than adding.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever done any travel writing?
Actually, not really. One piece on Kenya for an old website that doesn't exist anymore. But even that was sort of hybrid personal essay. So,
And in your opinion, what are some writers that kind of do what you do that you really enjoy, where they incorporate travel in their work, but it's not a travel log and it's not a guide either?
So my one of my favorite books, and it's such an underknown book, is by Francesca Mariano. It's called The Rules of the Wild, and it is just amazing, and it takes place in Nairobi. It's about Kenya in general, but it's about a European woman, an Italian woman who is living in Nairobi. So it also has a lot of things that take place in Italy when she goes home, and I just really love that novel so much. It's ridiculous. Actually, the character Nix, whose real name is Nicole, is named after a character in that novel. One of the main character's best friends in Nairobi is named Nicole, and I love that character so much. So that was really a model for me in terms of how to give an authentic sense of place that really is its own character, but that at the same time, it's really still a character-driven novel.
So you've mentioned Kenya a couple of times. What brought you to Kenya?
I won a contest through summer literary seminars. Mary Gateskill judged it, so that was one of the coolest things that ever happened to me because I worship her. And that was why I entered the contest. I don't normally enter contests, actually, because I figure it's just a way to part you from your money. But I was just so giddy by the prospect of Mary Gateskill even reading my work that I was like, yes, I will pay this submission fee. So and I won, and they sent me to study in Kenya for 2 weeks at summer literary seminars, which was amazing. But after that, my ex-husband and our 3 kids came out as well and spent the next 2 weeks. We did safari and we went to Lamu. So that I was there for a month, and it was incredible.
Wow.
Yeah. That all sounds amazing, starting with Mary Gateskill.
I know, right? Yeah. I gotta figure out a way to throw that in there.
Yeah.
Mary Gateskill, that's my word.
Well, you've mentioned that travel seems to also have been important to you, not only as a writer, but just you as a person.
Yes.
I mean, how did that even begin?
So it actually begins probably with travel being the complete antithesis of my familial experience growing up. I was raised in the house where my father was literally born,
Wow.
with a midwife in my old bedroom. And he lived there with his parents. And then when his parents died, he lived there with my mother and me. And he lived there until he was 79 years old. And we were surrounded by family. I had about 60 cousins growing up, and they all lived, most all of them, not every single one, but most all of them lived in about a 4-block radius of my home. People had been in that family, in that neighborhood since they'd come from Italy, and many just didn't leave. And so I was hungry to get out from a very, very young age. I fantasized constantly about the wider world outside my neighborhood. Although this was urban Chicago, it felt to me like a small town. Many of the women didn't drive. People often didn't leave the neighborhood for much of anything. So even going to Lane Tech a few miles north for high school was a big thing to not stay local in the neighborhood to me at that time. But as soon as I could get away and go away to college, I did, but I only went as far as Wisconsin. That wasn't far enough. So one summer, in the summer of '87, I met a bunch of Brits on a ship called the SS Clipper that used to have parties at Navy Pier in Chicago. I went there for a dance party, and one of my friends started dating one of these British guys who was working on the boat, and we all started hanging out with these British guys all summer. And the following year, in 1988, I went to England and went to visit every single one of them in their various locations. And from that point on, I pretty much would travel incessantly whenever I could at any budget I could manage at that time, whether that meant sleeping on train floors or whether at the opposite end of the spectrum, once staying at the Four Seasons Punta Mita, so I've done every type of traveling, from living in a squat to higher end traveling. And I love them all, although I have to say the most high-end traveling is of less interest to me.
Yeah, I agree. And we sort of come from the same background. My grandparents traveled a bit, but it was mostly road trips in the U.S., but nobody in my family traveled. Like, we would go from South Carolina to Minnesota to see them. That was our vacation.
Right.
So I'm glad I found a kindred spirit. And then, when I went to college, I fled from Rockford to Chicago.
Right.
And my parents were super panicky about it.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's a city,
Yeah.
And then I called them and told them I was going to Zimbabwe for a semester, and they laughed. And then I went. And they never laughed at me again.
I mean, our family's so similar in some ways. Although when I went to Madison, Wisconsin for college, it was, of course, a smaller and quote-unquote safer environment than Chicago, but my father was just devastated because no one in the family ever left. And so the day I moved away to college, he cried and said to my mother, "Oh, maybe she'll fail out of school." And my mom was like, "You're not supposed to be hoping that she fails out of school." But, it was hard for him because people in general, especially girls, but people in general just didn't leave family in his background. So, the day that I actually moved overseas to study abroad, he had an ulcer attack and ended up in the ICU.
Oh my gosh.
And my mother said, "Get on the plane." And I did.
That's funny because my dad did not have an ulcer attack, but he was sort of like, "You're wasting your money going abroad. What's there to see there?" And my mom was the same way, just like, "Go, get out."
Thank God for mothers.
Yeah. And now my dad and mom travel a bit, and my dad calls me and asks me about flights and travel packages.
Oh, that's
and stuff.
amazing.
I know.
That's
so
cool.
it's kind of come around. And I went to Iceland with them, and
Oh, that's awesome.
yeah, my dad hated it, but that's another story.
My father was also terrified to fly. So he had been to Europe once with my mother on their honeymoon, and he actually made her take a ship home because he said he was never getting on a plane again, and indeed he never did. He died at 93, and he took all of one plane in his entire life. So,
How much cajoling do you think it took your mom to get him on that plane?
well, I don't think he knew he was going to hate it until he was on it, and then he was like, "That's never happening again." So that was just it.
He just needed that one-time
Right.
experience to turn him off
He
forever.
was listening to a radio station, and my mother wanted to change it, and he said, "We haven't crashed on this station yet. We're not changing it."
It's like
He's a
the
character.
superstitions.
He did like to drive places, though. I mean, he used to take my mother to New York for a piece of cheesecake before New York cheesecake was in Chicago, and they'd turn around and drive home the next day. So,
Wow.
so he wasn't, it wasn't that he was someone who didn't want any kind of movement. I mean, both of my parents were people who kind of wanted more than they got to experience in life and had a lot of regret around that. And so I think that really fueled me as well.
Yeah, me too. Just seeing my grandparents travel and my mom not really going anyplace. And I think she hates to travel now, but I think she would have been a good traveler. You know, you got to start when you're young, like your kids in Kenya.
Oh yeah, my children have the major travel bug. My daughter was in South Africa last year on her own doing a study abroad thing. She got a scholarship for. She was, I guess, had just turned 17. So,
Wow,
that's awesome.
Good for her.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
Start when you like don't know any better.
Yeah, exactly.
And it was definitely, you know, it was an interesting experience for her too, because the travel to get to South Africa was very intense, and she ended up contracting a stomach bug and getting some kind of vertigo, possibly induced by the flights, possibly just, you know, in something else going on with her. But she ended up in the hospital in both Johannesburg and Cape Town, dealing with this gastrointestinal bug and this really profound vertigo that she had. And so, you know, that was far away from home. She was in the hospital on her own. And, you know, I think definitely, like you said, you know, being held up at knife point is not fun, but it's also, then you know you actually can survive this difficult thing, and it lowers your fear in the world. I mean, I think that ultimately she gained a sense of her own competence and her own capability and her own strength from the things that happened. She ended up having an amazing time. She was there for 3 weeks, and you know, she is applying again to do it next summer.
That's awesome.
Well, one of my favorite quotes in life is from Martha Gellhorn, you know, who is travel journalist, war journalist, etc. And it was it says, "Nothing is better for your self-esteem than survival." And that's kind of what I think about whenever someone questions this need or desire for, you know, for women to travel alone, or for really to do anything alone, because at least I think for me, and it sounds like for all of us, it's the competency, you know, just like getting yourself out of trouble.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I took my daughters a few summers ago to Guatemala, just the three of us. And, you know, most of the travel all the travel really that we had done prior to that had been in the context of, you know, their father had been with us as well. And it definitely was really, I think, an interesting, informative experience to be women traveling alone. When we were in Nairobi, I used to take them into the city center and like to the markets and things, just the three of us, without a man with us, just so that they could get a sense of what that is like in the world, because it is not like walking around, you know, alone in, say, Madison, Wisconsin. I mean, it's just a very different thing depending on where you are. You know, we spent a lot of time in Mexico, so they're familiar with that as well. But I really want them to have a sense of competence as female travelers, and not to always feel like you need a man next to you to get by.
Hence the birth of this podcast.
Yeah. No, completely. So but when you travel, do you actually set time aside to write, or is it something that you completely forget about?
I don't usually write when I'm on a trip. I mean, I always take a journal, but not fiction writing or sitting down and writing an essay or anything like that. I don't think I've ever done that on a trip, except for the story that later became the chapter I was talking about earlier, The House of Reinvention, about Arthog House. I actually did write a short story about Arthog House with a completely different character at its center, because Mary didn't even exist yet. But I did write a story while living there. But I lived there for a while, so it wasn't really while on a trip.
So you've mentioned your journal a couple of times. Have you always been a journaler?
Yes, pretty much. I'm not anymore. I only take a journal with me now when I travel. I don't really journal in regular life anymore, because I just don't have the time, which it's such a sad excuse. It's not really true. Everybody can make time for everything if they really want to. But, you know, I have 3 kids. I have a full-time job. I'm a writer of both fiction and nonfiction. I do freelance editing. I edit a magazine. So there isn't a lot of time for keeping a diary or a journal. And, you know, it's one of the things that's fallen by the wayside, but I do always still take it when I travel. But I started keeping a diary when I was 7 years old. So prior to maybe really my mid-40s, I did have an ongoing journal.
New Year's resolution.
You don't have a journal?
I'm the same way. Like, I write when I travel. I tried to write a journal in Chicago, and it just got so boring. Like,
well, I think the trick is that not to have to write every day.
Exactly.
I mean, I never, since I was a little girl, I never wrote every day in my journal. When I was a little girl, I would write every day, and as a result, of course, I didn't have anything to say. So some of the days would literally just say something like, "I played all day," and it's like, well, thanks for documenting that, young Gina. We really needed to know that.
Yeah. What else do 7-year-olds do? I mean,
yeah. I do have a journal, and I try to write every day, but it does evolve into just me complaining and being very emo in the pages. I just consider it like the worst things I write in general are in that journal, so hopefully once I get that out of my system, I can actually write something productive the rest of the day.
So it's like the artist way.
Yeah,
method.
that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, with the idea, although it's not 3 pages, and I don't necessarily do it in the morning or anything like that, but I think mentally that's what I end up doing, where I just like barf out this junk, and then I can go on and write something that's worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I have lots of travel journals, so yeah, I don't know. Maybe I need to be more interesting in my daily life.
What's next for you in terms of writing and in terms of travel?
Right now, I've been writing a lot of essays. I have one about to come out, which is about sexuality post-breast cancer. So that I had breast cancer in 2016, and that was just a really interesting topic to me because a lot of the things that you read and hear about basically your sexual identity after breast cancer are quite dire and terrifying, and not my experience, and I feel like it's important to have other voices out there. But I also didn't want to just write about my own experience, so it's really a journalistic piece that has a lot of interviews with other women who are survivors, and just kind of trying to put some other voices out there into the world about that. But I've been working on essays more in general than fiction lately, I think because they're shorter, and I just haven't had the time to delve into a novel again. What's next for travel? I just came back from Bombay Beach on the Salton Sea about a week ago. Actually, exactly a week ago, I just came back. And so that is a weird-ass place. I don't know if you guys know much about the Salton Sea, but it's basically, it's a dead sea in the middle of the Southern California desert. It's not very far from Palm Springs, and it's quite large. It's a big lake, and it used to have a resort community around it, but there were environmental disasters that caused the body of water to die. All the fish washed up dead on land, and the resort towns pretty much emptied out. And so now there's this sort of post-apocalyptic Mad Max quality to life there. And so Bombay Beach, which used to have, thousands and thousands of residents who were primarily vacationers and things like that and retirees, now has a population of 236. And it is in fact one of the most interesting places I've ever been in my life, and most people don't even know it exists. So my partner has been writing some things about it, and so he was actually living out there in a trailer for a month, just going native and kind of assimilating into Bombay Beach culture, which, like any place with 236 people, is really easy to do. You live there for 2 weeks and you know everyone in town. So, you're a regular at the bar where if you didn't show up, they'll come knock on the door and be like, "Hey, are you sick?" And it was really interesting. Like while we were there, they had this little music festival because they're a really self-contained community, and a lot of the people there are outsider artists and people who are kind of living off the grid in various ways. And they had this blues festival, and someone literally did just come knock on the door of his trailer and say, "Hey, will you play this thing?" And he's in a band, he's a musician anyway, but they had never heard him play music, and so he played, and it was really fun.
Wow,
that's awesome.
Yeah, it sounds like the setup for some quirky TV show too.
Yeah,
absolutely. There have been a lot of articles written about it, but they focused mainly on the disaster, like this is a hellhole element, which is not, in my brief experience, really accurate. It's one of the strongest senses of community of anywhere I've ever been. It's very much in some ways like my old neighborhood in that regard. And so I feel like that's an underrepresented part of what goes on there, and sort of just how the people there are really living on their own terms. I mean, many of them are kind of troubled and broke, but others are, some of those people as well as other people are also making a choice to just kind of live outside of convention in a place that doesn't require as much money, that doesn't require the things that you usually think of needing to live. It's a very stripped down lifestyle. The closest grocery store is something like 20 miles away, or I don't know. So
wow. Well, one of the strongest communities I feel like in resort towns is the townies.
Yeah.
who hate all the tourists.
Yes, there's that great line in the Jason Isbell song Elephant, where it's like, we just drink our drinks and laugh out loud and bitch about the weekend crowd. And that is the little bar in town is called the Ski Inn. And my partner is sober. He's been sober for decades, but he hung out at the bar because the bar there are two places to go, the Legion Hall and the bar. And so he'd go there, and there'd be like the usual 10 locals, and the bartender made a drink that he named after him that had no alcohol in it. And it's like a lot of film crews come through Bombay Beach because it's such a weird, interesting place visually, and a lot of photographers. And so when they would kind of come in, the locals would be like, damn weekenders,
That's so cool. Yeah.
Well, that about wraps it up. Where can we find you?
So my website is ginafrangello.org. I'm around Chicago. I teach full-time at UIC, and, I'm here.
All right.
Yeah, so check her out.
So, if you like this episode and you like Gina Frangello, buy her books.
Yes.
Inez and I endorse them heartily, and we're the chief tastemakers around here, so...
I consider myself a trendsetter.
Yes. And if you like the podcast, shoot us a review on iTunes. It would be wonderful if you did that. Or find us on Twitter and Instagram at XXWillTravel. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the newsletter. Pop into xxwilltravel.com. You know the drill. You're all hip to the internets. And until next time, go forth and travel.